X, the social network formerly known as Twitter, has packed up and left Brazil. Tech mogul and ex-owner Elon Musk announced that the platform's Brazil operations are suspended, quote, effective immediately, in response to what the company called, quote, censorship orders issued by Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. But what exactly does that mean? Will Brazilians still be able to use X? What is Musk's beef with Alexandre de Moraes? And is there a broader story at play here? That's what we'll be discussing this week. I'm Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil.
If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Andrei Novoseltsev, Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renacido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozzy Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more.
On Saturday, X's Global Government Affairs team posted that the company's legal representative in Brazil had been secretly threatened with arrest if they did not comply with what X described as censorship orders issued by Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who has overseen several investigations into how disinformation networks operate online. The statement said that the decision to suspend operations in Brazil had been made to, quote, protect the safety of the company's staff. X remains and will remain online in Brazil, according to Elon Musk. So this week I'm joined by Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, Ewan Marshall. Ewan, how are you?
Hi, Gustavo. All good. Hope everything is well there.
Yeah, things are great here. So tell us a little bit about what happened. Why did Elon Musk decided to pull his team from Brazil? And by the way, was it a consequential decision? Did X have a big footprint in Brazil?
Well, I mean, Gustavo, this part is quite unclear for now. I mean, I don't think anyone is really 100% clear on exactly how many staff X has or had in Brazil. But what we do know is that around 2 years ago, when just after Elon Musk took over Twitter, and now called X, that he laid off the vast majority of the team in Brazil, estimates around 90% of the team, leaving just a small sales team and a small legal team. So as far as, this isn't exactly Musk closing down a massive division of the social network. I mean, you could argue that he essentially did that a few years ago already. But, that's the kind of thing that, as far as the practical impacts of the decision are concerned, that are still maybe a little bit unclear. And within this kind of war of words that Musk has had with the Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, we've seen a lot of times where maybe Musk has claimed that he's going to do something and maybe he hasn't quite done something. And, it's a war of words essentially for now. But no, it's certainly a very forceful statement to say that that the social media, one of the biggest social medias in the world, would close down its operations in Brazil, which is one of the biggest markets for social media in the world. And there are a lot of legal ramifications for that going forward, potentially something that we can definitely touch on. I mean, if Brazil no longer has legal representation, X in Brazil no longer has legal representation in the country, then they're leaving themselves quite vulnerable to continued judicial orders, and failure to reply to these could be quite costly, in fact, for the company.
Costly how? Because, I mean, we have seen several other platforms such as WhatsApp or Telegram, which are messaging apps that are essentially used in Brazil as social networks. We saw these platforms being suspended temporarily. In the case of Telegram, the suspension was not enforced. It was lifted before its enforcement would be effective, because the company actually decided to have legal representation in Brazil. That was one of the requirements that the Brazilian justice had imposed to Telegram. So you're talking about that. You're talking about possibly X being banned in Brazil temporarily, depending on how they reply or do not reply to a court decision.
Yeah, essentially that. And I mean, I guess your definition of what is costly to X at the moment, and to Elon Musk in regards to X at the moment, is very relative. Because these orders that we've seen in the past for things like WhatsApp and Telegram to be taken down, to be suspended in Brazil, really didn't do much in terms of the success of those companies and those services in Brazil. Were there to be some sort of order to take down X in Brazil, I can't imagine that would lead to the death of the social media in Brazil, not by a long shot, because it still has quite a large following. But I think that's it as well. We have to kind of separate these things, because the main issue, I think, for Elon Musk with regards to what he claims is like pushing back against again what he calls censorship from the Brazilian Supreme Court, does, if when you really look at it, when you really put the details down on the table, it does look like what he basically wants to do is he wants to make sure that his company is not going to be able to be held liable for the content that's posted on the social media, which is something that the Brazilian courts are completely against, and something which is getting some of these social medias into trouble.
Now, let's make a difference, because when we're talking about legal problems that different platforms have with the Brazilian justice system, I mean, these are not one-to-one comparisons, right? WhatsApp had problems, especially because in several criminal investigations into drug rings, the company did not give messaging history to investigators, or revealed private data from users that it said it were encrypted, and that they could not deliver these pieces of data to Brazilian courts. In the case of X, is because since essentially 2022, when Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes took over as Brazil's chief electoral justice, a position he held until a few months ago, the Brazilian court system started to really crack down on disinformation networks there, and essentially order multiple platforms to ban, in Brazil at least, from servers that are coming from Brazil, access to content that is deemed as disinformative, something that Elon Musk is adamantly against. He presents himself as a free speech absolutist. I mean, something that is not necessarily true. We're going to touch on that later. But that is the root of the problem, right? It is the role of X in spreading misinformation in Brazil, and how the Brazilian court system is trying to rain down on that.
And crucially, when you're talking about the spreading of disinformation on X in Brazil, we're talking about the context of the 2022 elections and the run up to the 2022 elections, and a lot of what Alexandre de Moraes did at the head of the electoral court was to, in the name of, at least this is what he will claim, to preserve Brazil's democracy and to kind of avoid any rupture with democracy, which regardless of what you may think of Alexandre de Moraes, your opinions of his measures and his attitudes, definitely was a real risk throughout the 2022 election. And I think, a lot of people could wager that were another Supreme Court justice in charge of the electoral courts throughout the 2022 election campaign, that we might have ended up with a different result, not necessarily at the ballots, but we might have the outcome might have been slightly different, let's just say. So I think that, that's important kind of context in regards to this isn't just kind of disinformation or, an expression of opinion from what are largely right-wing accounts on X, but it's also what it was really in the most part was this kind of this discourse to try to inflame and push the possibility of a potential coup in Brazil. So I think that was kind of the important context to add to that particular type of disinformation in 2022.
No, and I mean, I think it's important for us to talk about the fact that, this effort, and there are a lot of discussions on whether the Brazilian court system sometimes go too far in the name of protecting a healthy public discourse. But it's important to understand that the disinformation networks that were engaging in campaigns to discredit Brazil's voting system, these are claims that have real-world implications, right? They drove radicals to plot a bomb attack against the Brazilian airport, against the Brasilia airport, and inspired hordes of supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro to storm government buildings in 2023. All of these actions that were trying to trigger a military coup in Brazil because these far-right radicals actually bought face value these claims that the Brazilian system was rigged and it was tampered with in order to prevent Jair Bolsonaro from being reelected. So, it's not just a matter of people not being nice on Twitter or X, is about the real world implications that these statements have, right?
Yeah, and as an example, if we're taking this in a kind of free speech lens, it's one thing for someone on Twitter with, X with 100 followers saying that they think that the election result in 2022 should be overturned and that people should storm Congress. It's one thing for a person to say that and express that view on a social media account. It's another thing for an account with huge influence and followers in the hundreds of thousands commenting on that particular possibility while people are preparing to storm the Three Powers Square in Brasilia and potentially launch an insurrection. So it was a very dangerous and very delicate time for Brazil, which I think, especially for a lot of the people who maybe defend Alexandre de Moraes' conduct as the head of the electoral court, I think they will definitely bring that up as a fairly reasonable justification for what in normal times would often be seen as overreach, really.
No, and without getting into the merits of whether Alexandre de Moraes goes or not too far, a big chunk of our audience comes from the US, and it's important, I think, to make the difference between the notion of free speech in the US and in Brazil. In the US, the First Amendment essentially gives you the right to say whatever you want. In Brazil, free speech follows a more of a French framework in the regards that it is more regulated. For instance, if you're filmed calling someone a racial slur or homophobic slur, you can go to jail. That is a crime. So you cannot just simply say whatever you want. Defending Nazism is a crime in Brazil, so on and so forth. So there are guardrails to what you can say publicly in Brazil. We don't have anything of the likes of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, so it's important to make that difference. But this campaign against disinformation that Alexandre de Moraes has waged essentially turned him into a lightning rod for far-right vitriol. And actually, you were talking about the impact of influential Twitter accounts. There is one, probably the most influential account, that has joined the bandwagon to bash Alexandre de Moraes, which is Elon Musk himself, right?
Yeah, and I think this is part of a trend that we've seen from Elon Musk in the last few years. Certainly, it certainly does predate his purchase of Twitter, now X, but it has certainly been stepped up since then. This kind of outward support for right-wing figures around the world in politics, of course, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and of course Donald Trump in the US, and even Javier Milei in Argentina. But it's and in the Brazil context, Alexandre de Moraes is the kind of he's like the perfect nemesis for them, because he provides a reason to rail against the Supreme Court, for example, which is something that is very important to the far right. And Elon Musk getting involved in that is quite important, I think, for the Brazilian right, as far as that's concerned. But I mean, we mentioned earlier about Elon Musk and his own views on free speech. I think he would claim that his free speech views echo what you talked about there about the right to free speech in the United States. Whereas he sees free speech around the world in that same lens. Whereas the Brazilian definition of it, as you well explained, is a lot more nuanced. Alexandre de Moraes, in response to Elon Musk a few months ago, I remember he said that freedom of speech is not freedom of aggression, which is something that in Brazil is quite important, but maybe would be less important in the United States definition of freedom of speech. And again, whether
Well, and
Elon
also one thing that is interesting is that Justice Moraes, in ruling from April, said that social media, and when he wrote this, he wrote in all caps, social media is not a lawless land. Social media is not no man's land. And he has actually defended at every opportunity he has that whatever rules apply to the real world should apply to the digital ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that has just put Musk and Moraes on a collision course. Musk has called for Moraes' impeachment on several attempts. He's called him a brutal dictator. He says that all of his decisions are unconstitutional. And, he says that, he calls him a justice in air quotes, essentially, which is the way that he tends to refer to Alexandre de Moraes these days. So yeah, he seems to have picked his target, and as I said, I think that does hold a certain relevance to the right wing in Brazil as far as politics are concerned, because Jair Bolsonaro lost the election, he was ruled ineligible, and we've also got a situation where Donald Trump is still out of office in the US. Obviously, he's fighting for election later on this year, but even though Elon Musk isn't a Brazilian, he doesn't vote in Brazil. He doesn't, he's not a huge Brazilian figure, but he is a huge right-wing figure these days. And he is someone who is still in power, if you could say that. As in, he doesn't have an elected office, but he's one of the richest men in the world, and he has influence over large parts of the world with many of the companies that he owns. And so to have him on the Brazilian far right side, I think, is kind of reinvigorating them, is keeping them engaged, and kind of keeping the fire burning while Bolsonaro struggles with his ineligibility.
Now, it's not just Musk that is targeting Alexandre de Moraes. The other way around is happening, right? Because Alexandre de Moraes has decided to investigate Elon Musk for obstruction of justice, incitation of criminal activity, and the, quote, willful criminal instrumentalization of X. What does that all mean? And why is Musk under investigation? Is it just because of his advocacy for absolute free speech? And also, does that have a concrete consequence for Elon Musk, who, like you said, does not live in Brazil?
Yeah, I think that was the main takeaway when that particular decision came out, when Alexandre de Moraes announced that he was going to be investigating, he was going to be putting Elon Musk under investigation, as in, what good is that going to do? Like what practical effect does that have? And that came in response to, so the Supreme Court issued requests, some of these many requests to take down right-wing accounts on X, which had been spreading anti-democratic content and kind of coup-mongering content. And Elon Musk publicly kind of railed against that, and that's one of the moments where he suggested that Alexandre de Moraes should resign, and he said that he was going to disobey any orders that Alexandre de Moraes issued, and it was in response to that that Moraes ordered this investigation, kind of like, he's trying to obstruct justice. He's inciting his company, as it were, to disobey these rulings. And interestingly enough, even though Musk claimed that he would disobey these rulings, he didn't follow through on that. Twitter eventually did comply with the rulings. They said to the Supreme Court that it was an operational error that had kept these accounts online, and they eventually did take the accounts down. Whether Musk was aware of that or not, I don't know, but that's how that particular spat turned out.
Now, it's interesting that this absolute advocacy for free speech has had its nuances, right? I mean, it's not everywhere that Elon Musk radically defends everyone's right to say anything. Can you cite us a couple of notable examples of that, and why Musk seems to have a double standard depending on the country where his social media platform is asked to suppress speech?
Yeah, I mean, there were examples in India and in Turkey as well, where there were similar requests to take down content and to suspend accounts and to ban accounts on X, on the social media. And, Musk and the company duly complied with that, without any of the sort of antagonism that we've seen in Brazil, any of the attempt to turn this into a public discussion and to turn it into a discussion about free speech and liberties. And also, I mean, if you could say beyond X, the company where he really makes his money, which is, with Tesla, one of their massive factories, a lot of their business, a lot of the manufactured business is based in China. And that's somewhere where, Elon Musk has been quite outspoken about how much he likes China and how great the country is. And that's never been an issue for him in terms of freedom of speech and all that sort of thing. But these sorts of issues that we know does happen in China, and China has an issue with that. And that's something that Elon Musk hasn't really taken China up on at all.
Now, circling back to Alexandre de Moraes, and like we said before, that there are a lot of discussions about whether or not Alexandre de Moraes sometimes may cross the line in his quest against disinformation. We have seen a couple of episodes where detractors thought they had this aha moment, showing that he had trespassed his obligations. One of them was Twitter Files Brazil, which was a revelation by journalists commended by X, by Elon Musk, to dig into the company's internal communications from the pre-Musk era and to see whether or not Twitter was engaging in censoring right-wing speech. And the Twitter file, the Brazil version of the Twitter Files, revolved around how Alexandre de Moraes was conducting his requests to the company in relation to accounts flagged as disinformative. Another one was last week's revelation that members of, so a piece of context, the Superior Electoral Court in Brazil is made of 7 judges. 3 of them are from the Supreme Court. So they wear these 2 different hats, and members of Alexandre de Moraes' Supreme Court office were making information requests to members of Alexandre de Moraes' team within electoral courts and doing so informally. So both cases were this sort of aha moments that actually many experts say that there is not enough juice there. Like, can you tell us a little bit about these two and why they are deemed so underwhelming by legal scholars?
Yeah, I mean, it was starting with the most recent leaks. It was certainly it was one of those kind of big bombastic stories that came out in Brazil's biggest newspaper, Folha de São Paulo, and it was an article which was signed by Glenn Greenwald and Fabio Serapio, Brazilian journalist. And so basically, it was quite. I think it was quite hard for even people who are, quite close to Brazilian politics and the ins and outs of these things. I think it was quite hard even for those people to understand immediately what was going on and what was being told, what was being shown and revealed in this story. But essentially, as you mentioned, there was a claim that the members of two different offices, which are under Alexandre de Moraes, were, making these kind of informal requests and not going through the proper channels, which, of course, is improper. If that is, if we're going to go by the letter of the law, but it's also, at the end of the day, it basically would mean that someone would have to kind of go through a formal procedure to request something of themselves. It was a very kind of confusing.
Alexandre de Moraes, the Supreme Court justice, requests that Alexandre de Moraes, the electoral justice, complies with this information request.
Exactly. Yeah. So that kind of part of it doesn't seem to hold as much weight in terms of a kind of a smoking gun, as it were. There are other parts of the leaks which are perhaps a bit more damning, which kind of indicate that maybe members, some of Alexandre de Moraes' aides, were trying to kind of maybe have these tailor-made reports on particular far-right Brazilian journalists and commenters, to kind of crafting the reports in a way that Alexandre de Moraes, the justice, would be favourable towards, ways that he would like, kind of customizing these reports, which is not proper behaviour. Alexandre de Moraes' name, and there are no messages sent from him in these leaks. His name, as it is, doesn't really show up directly. But those particular revelations are something which should be investigated, as they do. They come across quite questionable. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not the, as you said, it's not the aha moment that the detractors of Alexandre de Moraes were expecting. There was a lot of comparisons to the big car wash leaks of a good few years ago, relating to Operation Car Wash in Brazil, a big anti-corruption investigation, and these leaks by the Intercept Brazil that showed that the judge, Sergio Moro, was basically in cahoots with the prosecutor, Deltan Dallagnol, kind of combining requests, combining discovery of evidence and all that sort of stuff, which is and was incredibly illegal. But this would be a case of more, instead of Sergio Moro colluding with Deltan Dallagnol, this would be a case of Alexandre de Moraes colluding with himself, essentially, which is a little bit less damning, I think.
And Ewan, before I let you go, Brazil is holding municipal elections in October. Of course, disinformation is a big scourge in politics everywhere. And electoral courts have signed agreements with all social media platforms, X included, to have efforts to curb disinformation. But of course, as we know, usually platforms do the bare minimum, sometimes not even that, in order to curb disinformation. What could we expect, especially now that we're seeing AI entering the political world and essentially taking the power of disinformation to new heights.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it seems to be that every time we have this discussion, or every time these requirements are asked of social media in Brazil, that the same ends up happening. They do the bare minimum to adhere with these requirements, and the practical effect is that we still have an election campaign flooded with disinformation and all sorts of kind of nefarious behavior online, which can definitely influence, can definitely skew elections to what extent we're not quite sure, but it seems to be a kind of Groundhog Day thing, doesn't it? You know, that the authorities are trying to get ahead of it. They're trying to regulate and give these requirements to these social networks before the campaign starts, but the result always seems to be the same. But yeah, you know, wait and see. We can definitely, as you mentioned, the involvement of artificial intelligence in a lot of exchanges online these days, and a lot of internet use, is definitely going to be a big game changer, something which authorities are going to have to keep an eye out for. And yeah, we just need to see how it plays out, and hope that the electoral authorities are keeping on top of it, and regulating and policing that when they need to.
Ewan Marshall, thank you very much.
Thanks, Gustavo.
Ewan Marshall is the deputy editor of the Brazilian Report. And if you like Explaining Brazil, please rate us with 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second, and it really helps us reach a broader audience. Or better yet, if you want to support us, go to the Brazilian Report's website and subscribe to our content. We have original content coming out every day, exclusive newsletters, award-winning newsletters, and thanks to your support, we have been able to do exclusive investigations, and we have been named the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom. So go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. Thanks for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.